This is The Hypothesis, the show where industry experts debate and discuss growth marketing approaches, digital advertising tactics, measurement plans, as well as creative and growth strategies.
I'm Eric Sloan, VP of Data and Strategy at Thrive Digital.
I'm Tyler Power, and I'm the Director of Creative Services here at Thrive.
I'm your moderator, lay marketer, and asker of clarifying questions, Santana Blanchett.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. To get right into it, today's hypothesis is that digital marketing best practices can be used for good and for evil. So specifically, we're going to be digging into the creative side today, but I think we can talk more broadly about best practices because they're a bit of a trap door, or at least that's been my impression talking to some of the smart people in our agency. So let's kick things off with Eric to explain to us why we're cautious about using the term best practices.
Well, first of all, can we define what we mean by best practices?
I actually think that this is part of the trap.
Yeah.
I think best practices is almost as bad as people saying, oh, that's common sense. What does that actually mean? Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's the thing. I'm not even sure anymore. When I hear best practices, I tend to just kind of glaze over a little bit because it depends on what someone's referring to. Like, are we saying that best practices is just what we've done over the last 10 years in the industry? Or is it like a particular tactic or a strategy that has stood the test of time? I'm not even sure if there's all that many of those because like the industry changes so fast and what works and what doesn't work is somewhat dictated by how much noise there is in a particular market. So if a lot of organizations, for example, are all doing the same thing, then suddenly doing something new becomes a pattern interrupt. And so, that may actually drive more engagement. It might drive more results from a digital advertising perspective, even though for those organizations that have been running a program for the last 2 or 3 years, they've been really successful at it. What is a best practice is going to change on a regular basis. I think the primary reason why I glaze over when I hear the term best practice is just because it is kind of meaningless, right? So like there are certainly some things that we should all be doing, right? So like, and Tyler probably knows this a bit better than I do, but in the creative space, making sure that we're actually able to capture all of the inventory from an audience by having, as many of the ad formats that we can, and testing various different ad formats and doing regular testing. I mean, these are sort of best practices that are foundational to a digital advertising program. But when we start saying like, hey, you need to have someone who's looking at the camera or looking away from the camera, or like red text versus green text versus blue text, or those types of things, I'm pretty skeptical about any kind of best practices that exist in that sphere.
Before Tyler jumps in, I think the one thing I just want to add to that, for me, best practices always feels like a dog whistle for someone's trying to sell me something, right? Like the platforms talk a lot about their best practices because they want you to use their platform. Somebody selling a measurement tool tells you about measurement best practices because they want to sell you their measurement tool. Like often when I hear best practices, I hear this person wants to sell me what they're about to tell me is a best practice for that thing.
I feel like that's a good point. Like real best practices probably aren't behind a paywall.
Yeah.
There's no secret that's going to, 10x your marketing program or something like that is not out there, right? And so, if someone's trying to sell you something and saying that we're the only ones that know this, it's a secret, then that doesn't exist.
Okay.
Tyler just agrees.
Tyler's like, well,
I guess the way that I look at best practices is like the anatomy of an ad, how we're like composing that, and it's a list of must-haves in order for something to go out there. And now you don't have to have all of them, but I think the majority of them are quite important, right? Like you want something that's attention grabbing. You want to ensure that there is something there for brand recall, or that it aligns with the brand itself. You want to ensure that there's some sort of value proposition. You want to ensure that there's a call to action, that there's a clear narrative depending on where you are within the funnel. Like you kind of go through these checklists of things when you're constructing a concept and when you're constructing an ad, whether it's a best practice concept, right? Something that we know that's out there that's tried and true, like a before and after, a split screen, a testimonial, whatever that might be, that theme. We want to make sure that those elements are in there because we know that they have been proven to perform or convert or generate a lead, right? Now, some of those things are up in the air. Like we often have clients where we go through this list of best practices and we're like, say we'll take a meta ad for example, and we have a perfectly constructed social ad that has all of the elements that check off all those lists of the anatomy pieces that I put in there. And one of them is a CTA. Sometimes we put in an in creative CTA, but the brand's like, oh, we don't normally do that. Is that bad to take it out or leave it? We don't know. As a best practice, we usually do, right? We usually have some sort of call to action within that in-image creative. And then we have an in-platform call to action that's sort of native to the platform, right? And so those kind of conversations come up all the time where as long as we have whatever it is, 5 out of 7 of the best practice checklists, we should be okay. And we can, beg and borrow from the other ones if there is a brand rationale for them, or if there's a design rationale for them, or potentially in the past we've seen that it doesn't perform in these use case scenarios. So I think it's really up to us as digital marketers and creative to like make sure that we're addressing all the things that we know contribute to that performance, and then we can make some exceptions to those rules depending on the brand's desire and what they may want.
Is it safe to say then that the sort of best practices that you think about are more foundational or sort of strategic rather than tactical? So it's less about like, hey, always have a person in your ad, and it's more about like, hey, are we saying the right thing to the market? Which seems more foundational to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't say always have a person. I think to your point earlier, like there's best practices around testing, right? I think some of those best practices are testing exactly that. Should we test something that has a human element that sort of connects emotionally? Maybe they're staring directly into the audience, or maybe they don't like that. Maybe they want something that's more candid and they're staring off to the side. Do we want to test that against something that's based on social proof that doesn't have a person in it, but that has a testimonial, right? Those kinds of best practices then parlay into like the overall strategy of how we're testing this creative. So previously I was talking about the best practices of the construction of an ad or the anatomy of an ad or the elements. And then I think there's best practices that sort of parlay in terms of like, now how are we testing that? How are we implementing that? Do we have all of the aspect ratios and timestamps and across all the channels so that we're giving our performance partners the ammunition they need to go out and find out what works, right? So I think there's best practices at every stage of the process.
Tying back to our hypothesis here, like the evil part of best practices is sort of taking them at face value without actually internalizing the point of them, right? So like, it's just like, hey, I'm going to do this without testing it because it's a best practice. Like I tend to think back to something that was kicked around a lot about like landing page optimization. This was probably 8-10 years ago now, specifically about like having less fields on your landing page is a best practice, right? So like you should always try to reduce fields. Anyone who's run a lot of traffic to landing pages though can tell you that that's not always the truth, right? You can potentially decrease conversion rates if you're asking for extraneous information that the user like can't make a connection between like, why am I giving this kind of thing? Or if you're asking for too personal of information, but you're also reducing the quality of those leads, right? Oh. Yeah, maybe you've changed conversion rate, but like you're focusing on the wrong thing. So, that was kind of touted around the internet as a best practice for the longest time. I still see people talking about it, but it's not really a best practice in my mind because it's sort of like, okay, well, like do what's right for the particular situation. The market that you're going after, put something in front of them that is going to be enticing to them.
Yeah. And I think that's the evil part, right? Is like we apply, or we think we can apply best practice to everybody. Like it's a one size fits all. Right. It's a guideline, but those things need to be customized depending on the client, the audience, the vertical industry, what the product is. Like those things all determine the sort of like knobs that you can turn that dictate what those best practices are, right? We see a lot of time, like there's so much talk around the efficacy of motion and video. And we see oftentimes where static outperforms it, right? So in that case,
Yeah.
why would we recommend more motion, more video? Let's put our eggs in the static basket. And we see that time and time again. Now, it might be an outlier, but that's one of those things right now where motion, video, that's best practice. Give us more. And so that's what we think, and we give you more of that. But actually, we have these static versions of those concepts that are outperforming everything. So I don't think that there's a one size fits all strategy moving forward. You can use that as your baseline, but you have to know that you are going to need to adapt as you move along in the process and the project and those iterations and optimizations, right?
Right. And I think the interesting thing about what you just said reminds me of the quote unquote best practices that we sometimes get from vendors, right? And from advertising platforms that will say, like, hey, it's best practice to be, running PMAX and to be running all of the available formats. And it's best practice to, of course, as you say, like, you need to have video in market and those types of things, right? And yeah, that might be best practice for a vendor, but they're a sales team as well, right? And so, like, that's when it starts to get a little hazy, right? Because at least for me, it's sort of like, no, we need to look at objectively what's happening.
See, going back to that original point, if you hear best practices, sometimes they just mean sales.
Yep.
And we have a client right now where we follow best practice in terms of like media mix, right? Like we're kind of going half and half static to motion and video. And that's what we went out for our first flight. And we started to see that the statics were outperforming their baseline benchmark, the champion. And so what we did is we swapped that. What we did is now for our next round of optimizations or our net new creative, we're just creating statics to go out there and test performance of the static and basically concept prove which concept is better. Once we have a concept that is sort of rising to the top or that's beating their sort of benchmark KPIs, then the next optimization is what does that look like in a more robust narrative or a motion asset or a video asset. And then we test those against the static and against the champion. So we're taking a different approach than what we would normally do, but that's based on how these assets are performing in market, right? We went out with what we thought was best practice. We were proved wrong based on the data and the metrics that we were getting back, and then we adjusted our strategy moving forward.
I'm curious, and sorry, Santana, I'm taking over these questions, but I'm curious, Tyler, like, what you think the mechanism, like the underlying mechanism is of why like those statics would work better than the motion creatives in those types of situations. Because like my sort of intuition tells me that the underlying mechanism is distinctiveness, right? And so if you're using a social media feed, you're scrolling through, you come across something that stands out more than others. Maybe they've seen too many generic video ads or something along those lines, and so, like, there's some underlying mechanism that's happening there, and I'm curious if you have a perspective on like why that happens in certain situations and not others.
Yeah, I think it's the hook and their like ability to ingest it and engage with it quickly.
Right.
I think because right now, to your point, we've had vendors who are like, video is the way. And we're trying to tell a very simple message in a complex way that doesn't require that, right? Like, why would you use that tactic of like 6 to 15 seconds to tell the same thing that you can in a static ad, right? I've talked about this in past podcasts where like the strength of a concept should be judged by its ability to be told in a single frame.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of elaborate that into something more long form. And I think that's it, right? Yes, people are engaged with video and motion, but I think it should be used with a purpose and not just as a bell and whistle, right? And so I think what we're seeing right now with that particular client is we're able to communicate a message or a hook very quickly, right? Well, the instance that I'm talking about is we're trying to beat an offer. And the offer is always like offer, promotion, incentive often wins. So how do we beat that? And so we found ways of beating that with very quick copy, very like to the point visuals that are equal to that offer as a USP. And so I think that's what's helping those creatives perform is like very succinct, quick message that people can understand very quickly, that they can associate with a visual, that has their brand and the product, and then there's like a CTA. And that's it. Like, you don't need much more than that in those cases. Like, you turn that into an animation and you're just like moving a few things, making a CTA bop, maybe a little bit of like a slide animation. But at the end of the day, the end frame of that like motion is the static asset in itself, right? So
Right.
I think that's why those are performing so well. Now, if you have a longer story to tell, a longer narrative, something more complex in terms of a message, now you have a rationale for motion or video and moving into that. And then now you take a look at motion and video best practice, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
I guess, and tell me if this is a lazy heuristic, but I wonder if part of the reason why best practices are often bad for performance and often good for creative is because performance just has a tendency, it's numbers people doing numbers things, and it's easy to get formulaic with it. Whereas creative, especially coming from like a more traditional background, right? Like not the digital side, can sometimes get out of control. Like Tyler and I have both been in creative rooms where there's just like 18 million spinning plates and all these very creative people fighting over which is the coolest concept. And it's almost a field that can use a bit of structure from the best practice side. So it's like the number people, the performance people shouldn't fall into that formulaic best practices, and then the creative people could do with a bit of that structure. Is that a fair way to posit it, or is that too blanket?
That's an interesting take. Like I almost go to performance, like the act of doing performance media, digital advertising. You can go so granular and you can go so tactical that if you apply quote unquote best practices to like you could potentially apply it to everything. Right. Whereas what strikes me, and I haven't been in those creative rooms in my background, but what would strike me about what you just said there, Santana, is that in that creative room, like there's no, I'm assuming anyways, there's no best practice for like every little element of that creative pitch, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but you know, in digital advertising, especially performance media, someone has created a best practice about everything. You know, how often you should be checking your search query reports, down to like how you should be, you know, managing impression share for like different types of keyword groups and those types of things, right? I mean, someone has tried to create a best practice across all of those, and I think that that's probably the annoying part for me, is that a lot of those are just like, hey, it worked for me once, right? And so I'm going to write a blog post about it, and someone picks it up on LinkedIn, and then suddenly now it's like people are referencing this beautiful chart that someone has posted, right? And sort of like, hey, they ran it like once or twice, and how is that a best practice, right?
Canon.
That's kind of where it gets a little foggy for me, but yeah, I would imagine that there's probably less of those.
I think the tools, yes, but the concepts, no. Like I think there's a best practice for, and like specs you'd need for a direct mailer, let's say, like a direct mail campaign that has specs, but like the concept itself is like, there are no, I don't know. Tyler, you're the expert here.
Yeah, but like formats and best practices are different, right?
That's like technical specifications.
Yeah, that's true.
Like if we're talking about best practice for creative, you can go back like even things like art history. Do you know what I mean? Like there are tried and true things within creative that we know resonate emotionally with audiences, psychologically, and those things are like design fundamentals. Those are also best practices, right? When we're talking like rule of thirds, the golden ratio, composition, like those are all best practices from a creative technical standpoint that you can't ignore, right? That like people connect to emotionally, they connect to visually. If you don't abide by those best practices, people's eyes will like twerk, you know, color combinations, contrast, legibility, all of those things are considered best practice as well from a technical perspective, right? In those design details, and you must abide by those because people, they may not know why they're responding poorly to them, but there would be a reason for that. And that comes down to like how that creative is produced and manufactured. And then from a performance perspective, then we have these performance creative perspective, we have these other elements of best practice that we know that need to be in there for, you know, brand recall, awareness, conversion, consideration, all of those things. But I think when we're talking about best practice, you can go all the way back, right? Because those are all things that we consider within our design process and how we execute on ads.
Is there a point where you get so expert in the industry, though, that you know when to break them? So, for example, like rule of thirds and stuff, right? So, like, yes, that will make an image more beautiful if it's composed well. But I feel like there's certain people that know how to break those rules that actually make something look more interesting.
For sure. And I think that becomes part of the aesthetic.
Right.
Look at like a Wes Anderson, for instance.
Right.
Beautiful in terms of like his visuals, but he doesn't abide by the rule of thirds.
No,
Everything's centered up, right? Everything's patterned, symmetrical. And most people, for the most part, don't like that, right? You need some sort of asymmetry to create that like visual attraction that we go for. I think it's like if you understand the concepts, then you know, to your point, you know how to break them, right? Like going again back to like classical artists, we know Picasso for his abstract art,
right?
But have you seen his figure drawings? Right before he got into his blue phase in the abstract, he mastered all of that stuff before he broke every rule that was. So
yeah, so he got the craft right.
Yeah,
and you know how to break those rules, and that goes back to what I was saying before too about like that pattern interrupt of doing something differently almost creates that distinctiveness.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like if you're just doing it arbitrarily, it just creates a mess.
It just creates a mess. And I think for the most part, people will know that. Like I said, they may not know why they're reacting so poorly to it, but they're like, this is a mess. Whereas if people are very considerate and thoughtful about why they're making those decisions and breaking those rules, then I think people are like, oh, this isn't a mess. I'm actually interested.
I want to dig into that because I think while I'm loving this philosophical chat, I do think there's some interesting tactical stuff in there, Tyler. What are some digital creative best practices then? Like now that we've established that there are some good rules to follow for good reasons, you talked about rule of thirds, golden ratio. Like let's talk to me about some of those digital creative best practices.
Yeah, I think I touched on them a little bit at the beginning. Like I think you need something that's attention grabbing, right? A hook, something that's going to stop people from scrolling. People that have heard me in pitch situations or in creative discoveries, I often refer to what we're doing as like digital merchandising, right? It's like on a shelf, what's going to like separate you from the pack and make you want to reach out for that product that's setting you aside from everyone else on the shelf. This is a digital shelf. So what are we doing to like make you stop and look at it? Oh, I'm interested in this. So that attention piece. I think it's coming from a brand background, you need that brand piece, whether it's the logo, the icon, the distinct color palette. You need to make the connection between the brand and, you know, the audience so that they understand who that is. And so if they haven't made the decision to purchase or be a lead, that when they see another ad down the road, they can make that connection to something else they've seen. I think you need to be clear about your like value proposition and the brand positioning that's out there. So the messaging, what you're trying to say, who you're trying to say it to, and when you're trying to say it to them. I think it's important to have some sort of social proof. So in the anatomy of a paid ad, if you're not having an ad that's a testimonial, is there something in the surrounding copy in platform headline that can point to a trust signifier that can be like maybe 50,000 5-star reviews or something to that effect? And then you need to have some sort of call to action. You need to let the audience know what it is you want them to do and where that is going to be transporting them, whether that's to a landing page, whether that's to a blog, whether that's to a form, whether that's to a quote, or request a quote. You need to have that sort of like action item in there so that they know that now that they've stopped, now that they know who you are, they know what you're trying to sell them, they know what you stand for, they're comfortable enough going to that sort of secondary action and taking an action. And then just having the right tactical mix to support all of that stuff. So now that you have all of those best practices, can you apply those to everything else that you're doing to support that, whether it's your meta ads, your TikTok, your display, your YouTube, your landing pages. And like, I know we're very much in a digital sort of, focused area, but does it also connect to the other peripherals that are out there, right? Does it connect to your traditional? Does it connect to your linear TV if you're out there? Does it connect to your print material? Does it connect to your activations? Like all of that stuff needs to be cohesive.
I really like that. Even that in-store experience, right? Like, how are you making your creative omni-channel? And like, not even omni-channel just for the ads, like
Yeah,
omni-channel for your whole experience.
for sure. I can't tell you how many times where we got everything like lined up and it looks good. You set it out on the table, everything looks like it belongs together. And then we put an ad out there. We got a really good click-through rate, but no conversion. And then we go and like, oh, well, this landing page looks nothing like everything else. So now we've created this like inconsistency and this disconnect that creates mistrust. And like, oh, I loved everything up until this point. Now you've taken me here, and the visual, the creative, the colors, it doesn't match. It's like, am I in the right place? Did I make a mistake? Did you take me to the wrong spot? And then we've lost them, right? So like, it's very, very important that all of those things fall in line and adhere to best practice.
It's like you're creating a dissonance, right? When something doesn't match up like that. And like the flip side of the best practices for me anyways is like when you follow things blindly, it can actually lead to more of that dissonance. So like
Yeah.
with a content strategy, following best practices about like the types of images or the length of the copy or like any of those things, like if that's at odds with the sort of culture of the organization, then, you know, I mean, consumers are smart. They're going to see that dissonance, right? If you really only focus on posting certain times of the day or something like that, because some blog post has said that that's the ideal time to post. It's the same thing where, you know, at a certain point, there will be a sort of critical mass of people doing the same thing. And then so now, in order to be different, you actually have to do something different, right? And so that building trust point that you made, Tyler, I think is like so important, because like we don't want to let these sort of standards or best practices get in the way of that building of trust, right? I mean, just breaking down those barriers and just being real with your market goes a long way, I think, too, right?
And it should feel seamless. Like,
yeah,
they know when there's a disruption. Do you know what I mean? Like, they know when something doesn't fit, even though they may not be able to put their finger on it. They know automatically, oh, something isn't right here. And then that's all it takes. That sort of like instance of reconsideration, and it's over, right? You've lost their trust. They'll go elsewhere, because likelihood is there's another competing brand that has that journey dialed in and it is seamless.
And even in the corners that you don't immediately think of when you think about marketing, right? So like, is your customer service also providing that same seamless experience? Are the tools that they're using also holistic in that way? Are your recruiters who are finding new candidates for the organization, are they providing a similar experience, right? Like, is that
Totally.
whole experience like kind of showing what you want your market to see?
Totally. Well, we've seen the same problem. I use that landing page as an example, but I've seen the same issue with that journey being fully complete and seamless, and then you're getting all of the leads, and then it's your sales team or your customer service team that can't convert because all of those brand promises and those positions isn't being fulfilled on that end, right? Like everything that you said in terms of who you are and what you offer, all of a sudden they got to get on the phone with someone and that experience is awful. Whether or not they have the proper brand script or the touch points that they have, it doesn't align with everything they've experienced to the end. And then you're just being made a liar.
Well, everything's brand. Like everything is brand, right? And I think that's something that a lot of marketing organizations don't necessarily take into account, is like, yeah, every single part is brand. It's what people say about you when your brand's not in the conversation. And so if that's not all lined up, danger zone.
So you're saying we can't just add trust signals to a landing page and that builds trust on its own?
I want to be empathetic for a second, though, because sometimes it is hard to be congruous, and it is tempting to follow what seems to be working for other people, or what we would call a best practice, right? Like I think about us, for example. I handle Thrive's content, and I avoid following like trending audio or making jokes or things like that because it wouldn't be on brand for us, but it might get a lot of engagement. And so I do have empathy for those brands trying to take a risk because they see it working for other people.
You can tell more jokes in these conversations, Santa. That's fine.
I mean, like the jokey TikTok style videos, right? Like I have nothing
Mm,
against them. I think they're great, but they're just not on brand for Thrive.
right.
But I see the temptation, and so I guess I would be interested to hear from your perspective, Tyler. Do you have any insights for brands on when it's okay to hop on trends, when it's like not? Like, talk to me about best practices around trends.
Yeah, I think it's what, to your point, is like, does it fit the brand? Is it right for you? Right? Like, we do so much UGC right now, and we do UGC for all kinds of clients, and we vet creators en masse. Sometimes we come across creators and we're like, you know what? Like, these guys fit this brand almost perfectly, and then we'll pass it through and they're like, no, not okay from the brand. I think sometimes the brands, like I mentioned before, they treat it too fragile, and like there's a time and place to experiment for that. And I think the UGC sort of realm is that place, but it depends how comfortable they are, right? You know, it's just it's up to them, and we always try to like, well, let's test it, and sometimes that's enough of a rationale to test it, but yeah, it's all around like how comfortable they are glomming onto some of those trends and whether it fits their brand aesthetic, their brand tone of voice, their brand look and feel. At the end of the day, we can only make those recommendations. It's up to the brands to pursue them, whether they are brave enough, right? Those trends and best practices are out there. They're working for a reason. It's all about the willingness of those brands to try. There's lots of brands out there that are willing to try anything once. And if it works, then they'll pursue that. And then all of a sudden that becomes part of their brand, right? Like that can be an offset or an offshoot of what their brand is. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be all encompassing, but if it's an element or a tactic or an execution that works, we'll always try and put it on the table. But at the end of the day, it depends on whether or not they're willing to take that risk.
One other question then that I want to ask while we're tangentially talking about this is how should brands or how do you think about deciding whether to reuse a concept or rework a concept or just start from an original one, like start from scratch? Like when we're making creative concepts for our clients or when we're deciding what creative to run in our ads, how do you decide between going back to like strong performers and to just like scrapping it and doing a whole original new concept?
Well, I don't think we ever avoid strong performers. The strong performers tend to become our champions that we want to beat. And so we will continue to use strong performers and optimize on them to make them stronger. I think if you were to abandon those ships, it would be based on fatigue. But a lot of clients we see, like those strong performers become the baseline of like what we are trying to achieve, and the net new creative becomes those challengers.
Interesting. So maybe that's one of the best practices then. Keep your strong performers, use them to benchmark.
One of the clients we're working with right now, they have a benchmark for every product in every category, and we're out there trying to beat them based on their chosen KPIs, right? And if we can find one to beat them or come close, then that sort of makes the next testing cohort. And if it's close enough, then that becomes BAU. And then we go back to the drawing board and we create net new concepts for those or to challenge those.
All right. Well, I think that's kind of the questions that I had. Was there anything that we didn't talk about that you think is worthwhile?
I feel like I could ask Tyler questions for another hour, but I'll ping you on Slack.
I think it's important to a point about best practice and brands. I say this like all the time, is like, I think it's important to be bold and brave. You know, if you built a brand, I understand that, you know, it becomes their baby and they don't want anything to tarnish that. But I think we work in a space where there's a lot of forgiveness for creative license, and this is the best place to learn, right? And so I think it's important for clients and brands to be open-minded, especially around things like best practice. I'll use another scenario. Like we use a lot of like comparison ads and like challenging competitors. And there's clients out there that are just like, yeah, we can call them out. Just show the challenger. You can name them by brand, or maybe you alter the name of the brand and you show the colors, and they're willing to go after them like that. Others are like, oh no, we can't do that. Like, we can't even be close to the color. It has to be a made up product. It has to be a made up name, and it dilutes the idea. And I don't think you give the concept or the best practice a fair shot. Right. And I think that deters a lot of clients from pursuing some of those things because of the backlash that they may receive. But if you don't go down that road, or halfway down that road, or at least to see, you're never going to know. And so I think it's important, like to what we said earlier, it's best practice for a reason. It works for a reason. It's worked for other brands, other products for a reason. So it's worth investigating. If it doesn't work for you, then it's not best practice for you, and it's best practice for someone else.
Well, especially in the AI age, right? It used to be the production of that creative was often a huge hurdle for brands to overcome. That was the thing stopping them. But now production's not going to be a problem anymore, coming up real soon here. And when that happens, like, you better have a bold concept. Awesome. Well, thank you two so much. As always, I love chatting with you guys.
This has been The Hypothesis. Thank you so much for tuning in. For show notes or to get in touch, find us at thehypothesisshow.com or at Thrive Digital, both linked for you in our description box. And if you liked today's episode, we'd love if you'd rate and review wherever you're listening or watching. Thanks!